Hey Phil, this is Cameron.
Hey, what's up, Kim?
Man, I gotta talk to you about something. Have you been watching the news?
Dude, what is going on? Pocket politics with Phil and Cam. Why? Why are we doing this?
I think it's gonna matter.
The only thing they want to talk about is guns and abortion.
My own views, I want to see the Republicans get away from the social issues.
I'm not saying that Republicans are idiots.
You hear something like that, it's powerful.
As an American, I was disgusted.
You could make the argument that you're probably more in the middle as well.
I think that's just a story that somebody's telling you.
Again, well, with the facts, this is true. Everybody knows
What
it.
facts?
So-
What facts? Who does this hurt more, Republicans or Democrats?
Boy, I've been thinking about that.
Welcome back to Pocket Politics. For our listeners, we are a couple days late. Hopefully, we didn't keep you waiting too long. Another great episode ahead today, Cam. We've got the biggest news of the week. Another police killing, right? That is police killing an unarmed, not proven guilty citizen of the United States. We've got more mass shootings over the past week that we're going to dig into just a little bit. And of course, we can't go on too long without Trump news, so we will be talking about him again this week, as well as Pence, trying to be part of the club. Apparently, he's doing what all the other cool kids are doing. And we've got some Oath Keepers convictions, some stuff about Congressman Omar, and some other stuff in the United States Congress. But without further ado, Cam, I hope you had a good week. I certainly did, but let's get into it.
Yeah, let's do this. Why don't you tell us a little about the big news with Mr. Tyre Nichols?
Yeah, so Tyre Nichols, the biggest thing is this happened a couple weeks ago. He was effectively beaten by police after a vehicular stop and died 3 days later in the hospital because of the wounds sustained during the beating. It kind of made some news at the time, I think, but this really came to a head over the last week because this released all the footage. So they released the body cam footage from 6 separate police officers, 5 who were directly involved and have since been fired and charged with potential crimes. And they also released street camera footage as well.
I mean, I'll be honest with you. Having watched what I did of all this, I was appalled seeing it, as was, I think, pretty much the entire country when we saw the release of this footage. I mean, it was awful to watch. It's quite honestly hard for me to sit here and kind of rehash stuff that hasn't already been said, because I mean, this stuff's been all over the news. But I think you and I would both agree that it was really appalling stuff to watch. And then, the question really going forward is kind of how this drives policy and what kind of change we may see.
It's hard to see. I mean, this is kind of on the back of the protests in 2020. But, we also, we didn't really go that long. It was only a couple weeks since this happened, right around the holidays. It happened to somebody else. I mean, a guy was tased to death, right around the Christmas holiday. Tyre Nichols was a 29-year-old guy. He was a father, right? He was they talk about he was an amateur photographer. It's unfortunate that, the circumstances, he gets pulled over, he gets drug out of the car, he tries to tell the police that he didn't do anything. He was tased multiple times, he was beaten with an asp. And then you watch this video and you see this cop throwing like 5 haymakers directly to his face, and that's after the other 3 around picked him up so that he could take that punch after he'd already been kicked while on the ground. So it's just disgusting, but we're not going in the right direction as a country, Cam.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you kind of hit the nail on the head. Disgusting to watch. I mean, you talk about direction the country's going to go, etc. I think the question now from a political standpoint is, where does this go, and does this bring back some more of this discussion on policing reform? And so kind of for our listeners, that's been a thing out of the the Senate at least is we've seen some bipartisan efforts. Now they haven't really accomplished a lot, but there's been some bipartisan work on police reform in the past, which has been Cory Booker out of New Jersey, Raphael Warnock out of Georgia, Tim Scott out of South Carolina. 3 African Americans from the Senate have worked this in the past. The question is, Phil, are these 3 going to get back onto this police reform work? Is this kind of going to happen now, or are they going to be back in the news?
Well, I think it has to happen. I think they're going to try and do something. Now, how far it goes, I just don't know. But again, I don't necessarily think that the federal government needs to be involved in local jurisdictions and policing. But at this point in time, we're in an environment where they're not doing it enough themselves. And so there has to be some sort of restraint. Again, I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what kind of laws could be put on the table at the federal level, but it's gone on way too long. 2020 was already too late. And unfortunately it erupted probably because people had nothing else to do but sit at home and watch the news and be hyper aware of what was going on around them. But this is happening too much. It's gone too far, right? Last year, more citizens were killed by police officers than any year prior. And just to give you some perspective, in 2009, it was less than a couple hundred people that died at the hands of police, right? Yeah. And over the next couple of years, the average was somewhere around 382. And then last year, it was 1,176 people. It's a blatant violation of their lives. The side of the car says serve and protect, right? Not drag them out of the fucking vehicle and kill them.
Well, so I'll start in on this. I mean, just a little bit. We've touched on policing and bad policing and reform and some, certainly at least one other episode, probably 2 or 3. But I'm with you. I'm not necessarily a big fan of the federal government just reaching in on everything. But at this point in time, as you mentioned earlier, they may not have a lot of choice. And, speaking of the federal government, I mentioned Senator Tim Scott a moment ago. I want to just read for our listeners here the statement that Senator Scott made. And this is, I quote from Senator Scott: "My heart is with the Nichols family as they grapple with the reprehensible death of their son, father, and friend Tyre. The death of Tyre Nichols was a result of a clear, vile abuse of power, and the unwarranted torture of a man already in handcuffs should lead to swift, decisive action. We've been here too many times before, and we cannot continue down this path. America cannot stand silent. This was a man beaten by the power of the state. We must unite against this blatant disregard for human life, especially from those we trust with immense power and responsibility. This footage is jarring and unnerving. We cannot let the pain of the Nichols family be in vain. Let us listen to their pleas to make our voices heard peacefully and in a productive way that forwards the cause of justice and a more just America. Let it serve as a call to action for every lawmaker in our nation at every level. The only way to bring light from darkness is to be united." End quote. Again, that's from Senator Tim Scott, Republican of South Carolina. And I will add, Phil, Senator Scott has said that he has been pulled over 18 times for no other reason than just because he is an African-American man. Now, again, I don't know exactly what the metrics is he's using, et cetera, there, but at the end of the day, he recognizes it as a problem. As I said, and we could sit and speculate all night. I know we're not going to, but we'll wait and see on whether Senators Booker and Warnock and others in the Senate push this up. So we'll see that in coming weeks. But I'm with you, and I'm with Senator Scott and others. If something, we've got to do something to curb some of this dangerous environment that we're in.
Well, and at the end of the day, we talked, you and I both kind of mentioned, the federal government getting involved in some capacity or another. But at the point at which constitutionally provided rights are being violated, they really have no choice, right? And if you look at it, Tyre Nichols, his First Amendment, his Fifth Amendment, his Sixth Amendment, and his Eighth Amendment rights were all violated. And we can get into those, but that's, his First Amendment right to free speech and to have the freedoms of a citizen are inherently violated because his life was taken away by the government. Okay. his Fifth Amendment right, for his eminent domain was violated, right? He had no ability to a jury trial. He had no ability to due process. All those things included. So, yeah, the statement was really good, really powerful. It makes me think, but the federal government, cannot allow a local jurisdiction or a city jurisdiction or a state jurisdiction, for that matter, to go in and violate human rights and constitutional rights. It should be noted that it now appears evident by the statistics that tasers, like non-lethal means of subduing people like tasers, and then also body cams, are not helping. It's, before, granted, we couldn't see the video. Now the only difference is we get to see it.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I mean, I think, again, we see how this, takes a turn politically, and we'll see what comes of it from, certainly the Senate and the House as the weeks go on. But at the end of the day, certainly a tragedy that happened recently, and we'll watch this issue going forward. Phil, why don't we turn this one into yet another issue that has been at the forefront of things, and that's mass shootings.
Yeah, so I can't remember if it was Thursday night or Friday night, but there was another one in California just this past week. But right now we are above the days in the year in numbers of how many mass shootings we've had in the United States. This year so far, that's only including 4 people injured or killed in the shooting event. So it doesn't necessarily encapsulate everything or is a perfect definition of a mass shooting. But at this point in time, we are, like I said, higher in number than the days we've had this year.
Yeah. You mentioned the one that happened. I thought it was early Saturday morning, but it could have been Friday, whatever. But the most recent one in Los Angeles, there was 2 others about a week prior. So basically California had 3 of them within a week's time frame that were going on, kind of scattered around different parts of the state. At the end of the day, though, you and I have talked about it. We've debated guns and gun control on here before. I don't want to rehash a whole lot of that tonight, but I will say, the question now comes, what next, right? Are we going to see the federal government put in place more restrictions? Is it going to be at the state level? Certainly, depending on what side of the aisle you're on, right? Depends on where you're at with that. But Phil, are we going to see much happen now?
Well, one, I don't think we are. But 2, I will say it's important to note that, you and I are in the military, right? And it should be said that maybe the average citizen should have to do at least as much as you and I do to hold a firearm. We have to go to yearly training to maintain our qualifications. And not only do we have to go to the yearly training, but we also have to go out and demonstrate, right, a level of proficiency with multiple different weapons in order to be armed with those weapons for part of our job. So I don't think it's totally unrealistic to recognize the fact that the Second Amendment has been completely perverted and enact some sort of simple, laws and requirements that require people to maintain the basic minimum threshold in order to own and possess a firearm, right? And I know you're probably going to disagree, but at this day and age, it should not be easier in most states in the country to get a firearm than it is to get a driver's license. It just shouldn't.
Yeah,
I know that the Constitution doesn't specifically mention your right to own a car, but that's because cars didn't exist, right? But neither did semi-automatic weapons. Keep in mind, when they wrote that the Constitution, you would have to pack every single bullet individually with and load a piece of flint or whatever the case is, right? So times have changed. We've got to do something to update it. We've got to stop this from happening.
Yeah, well, I will definitely disagree. One, I'm not interested in nationwide registrations and tests and all that for something that I feel is, our constitutional right, the right to bear arms. But I will say this, at the end of the day as well, people talk about the semi-automatic weapons. I would caution people on that because there are awful lot of semi-automatic weapons out there that are used for hunting that are not necessarily the high capacity magazines, but the old fashioned 22s and, other calibers that are the non AR type weapons. So again, I think there'd have to be definitions on that. But what I've looked at, I was kind of just doing some research on this. According to Daniel Webster, who does research with the Johns Hopkins Research Committee, he points to studies that say, they don't seem to associate reductions in mass shootings AR bans, excuse me. These AR bans, according to this study, do not seem to be associated with reductions in mass shooting studies when they looked at 600 mass shootings in 45 states from 1984 to 2017. Now, what they did show, though, was these studies showed you're better off controlling who has the guns rather than the type of gun. And so, interestingly enough, I've heard some people, Senator Joe Manchin, I think, was one of them, and some others that have said they want to support universal background checks. And that seems to be very, very popular in the nation. I've heard statistics that show anywhere from, 89 to 90% of the country agrees with the background checks, right? And the fingerprints and that go in with background checks, or fingerprinting being for handguns, and there were some different things that have gone in there. I don't see sweeping change coming. That may be something in the future, though, that they can continue to pursue, which would be the universal background checks, and kind of continue to try and uphold or try and strengthen some of those. But as far as other things with guns, you and I have debated it. We are in probably different. We see these things differently. I just don't see anything happening with this, at least in the immediate future.
Yeah, I just think it's absurd too. I mean, if you look at another civilized country and our neighbor, right, which also allows people to own weapons. Now, granted, I don't think in Canada you're allowed to own some of the types of weapons you're allowed to own in the U.S. But look, a lot of people in Canada still hunt. A lot of people in Canada need to defend their homes from whether it's people or
grizzly bears,
grizzly bears, things like that, right? Even wolverines and things of that such. But it's got to be noted that
in the U.S., as opposed to Canada, you're more than twice as likely to die in a gun homicide.
And gun ownership is actually pretty high in Canada. Now,
it is.
There's probably some outlying, things in that statistic, but
the same study shows that you're more than 6 times as likely to die in the U.S. as you are in Australia, and more than 20 times as likely in the U.K.
We can both sit here and cite different studies, but if we don't change anything, it's just going to keep happening. And it's gotten way worse in the past decade. It's probably continued to get way worse.
Yeah, I mean, again, at the end of the day, I think the question has to be, these laws or these proposals, are they going to make our communities safer? And like I said, I don't see much of any movement from the political front happening. I think while you and I may kind of disagree on what we want to see done here, I think we would probably both agree on that, as you kind of alluded to earlier. Likely not much going to happen here. But, we'll, obviously continue to watch it, continue to see. And sadly, there will, most certainly be more mass shootings this year.
Yeah, and it just so it, we can talk about what the country as a whole thinks. A poll in October of 2022 saw a 57% approval rating for more stringent gun laws, with only 32% advocating to stay the same.
Yeah. Now, again, I don't know what that poll is suggesting as far as, what they're looking for. Was it just, if it's just kind of a generic, would you like more gun laws, or if they actually cited and said, hey, these would be the things you're looking for? That I'm not sure of. But again, as of right now, in the political climate we're in, I don't see any change coming about anytime soon.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the poll wasn't suggesting any nuance other than 57% of those polled approve of more stringent gun laws. So, but to kind of cap this off, I put some data on the Facebook. So if you go look, there's a couple of different statistics that I threw up on Facebook. I encourage our listeners to not only go look at that, but everything else, because Cameron and I, mostly Cam though, are constantly adding content to the social media realm of for our listeners to kind of take a look at.
Yeah, definitely. And I was going to say, one of the things that I've definitely been putting up on the Facebook page over the last week has been plenty on Donald Trump. He's back out there on the campaign trail here, Phil, as of this past weekend. So he was in New Hampshire and South Carolina. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it looks like he started the primaries a little bit early. Is that what's going on? He's confused about what month and time we're at. No, yeah, he got out there. I mean, coming off the backs of several polls that have him head to head with DeSantis and him winning by quite a bit. I know we mentioned that last week. He gets out there and does some stuff. It did look quite a bit weaker and a little bit dejected compared to what he has certainly done in the past with the crowds that he's drawn and stuff like that. Is he really in it for the long run, Cam?
I think he is. While I do think you bring up a good point, these rallies or campaign events or whatever we're calling them from the past weekend, they didn't exactly look like the classic Trump rallies. He didn't seem to be maybe as fired up as he always was. I do think he's in it for the long haul. And if you look at his talking points that he was using this weekend, he was going after a weak military. He was talking about how angry he is. He kept stressing that about how angry he is, and he's more angry than ever, and et cetera, et cetera. Certainly the attacks on Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, they were there, going after transgender rights. He was attacking electric vehicles, the weaponized Department of Justice. He also said things like he could negotiate peace with Ukraine and Russia in 24 hours. I mean, he was going on and on. A lot of them were the usual kind of Trump talking points. So that seemed reminiscent of what we've kind of seen in the past. But, I mean, going back to your question, no, I think he's definitely in it. One other thing I was going to bring up, Phil, I think he is feeling some heat from Ron DeSantis because he was blasting DeSantis this weekend, calling him disloyal and, saying, well, I helped put that man in the governor's seat down there in Florida and, look how he's treating me. And, he kept going on and on about the loyalty or lack thereof from DeSantis. And then he was asked about other people, Nikki Haley and some others that were getting in the race or are speculating about getting in the race. And then he kind of talked like, oh, well, I've talked to Nikki Haley and told her if her heart's in it, go ahead and jump in it. So, I mean, Phil, is he really, do you think he's really feeling pressure from DeSantis, or is he just out there kind of just being bombastic like Trump oftentimes is?
No, I think this is typical Trump. The only thing that I'll say is different from now, that, and like leading up to 2016, right, is that Trump was extremely popular with the American people when he was airing their grievances, right? And so it looks like, over the last couple of days, he's out there, and even what he's been truthing and putting out, on his social media site and all this stuff, it appears that he is no longer in the business of airing everybody else's grievances out there. It's more of just his own. And so I don't think this sells nearly as well as what he did in 2016, right? He goes out there and he really, fear mongers and kind of puts, talking points out that people can actually identify with. And I don't think this is the same, just still, beating down this election, kind of talking about, talking about Joe Biden and how, he could somehow, in the war, what woke military, whatever kind of bullshit he's saying is just more of his complaints. And so I don't think that the voting bloc is going to identify as heavily. Now, you do have that certain percentage. People speculate 26 to 28% of the country that are just behind him no matter what. But I don't know that it's going to go as well. Do I think he's still going to beat DeSantis? Yeah. And we can see that just overwhelmingly. I mean, polls aren't always right, but there's more than a 20% gap in some of these. So,
some of that depends on the state. Some of that, I was going to say too, Phil, depends on the state. I think I've seen certain states where DeSantis is probably closer, but I will say this about Trump's, popularity still. When I drive around the countryside and mainly out into, in the country, kind of more of the rural parts, I will say this. I still see Donald Trump signs. I do not see any Nikki Haley signs. I do not see any Mike Pence signs. I do not see any, Ron DeSantis signs. But again, I see Donald Trump 2024, Trump this, Trump that. So he's still got his base there. But yeah, I mean, obviously we're going to see more as time goes on. The thing about it is, at the end of the day, the only person in the Republican Party that has thrown his name in the hat for the 2024 election is Donald Trump. And so that's really the real question now is who is actually going to take the next step besides Donald Trump and throw their name in? And I almost feel like all these other candidates are kind of just sitting there waiting, like, well, let's wait and see if DeSantis gets in. Let him take a few punches and get weakened, and then maybe I'll get in, or let Mike Pompeo get in, or whatever, right? They're all kind of sitting there on the fence, I think, waiting for someone to make a move while Donald Trump is sitting there and he's campaigning and he's out there kind of generating up his base. As you mentioned, his talking points, some of them are old, recycled. A lot of them are probably kind of recycled from his past, runs. But, one thing I think that is probably hurting him is still the talk of the stolen 2020 election. I mean, I think people, even many, on the Republican side, want to get away from that, move on from that, et cetera. So, we'll wait and see. Certainly we haven't heard the last of him, but, speaking of Trump getting his message out, I will also add for our listeners this past week, Meta has announced that they are going to let him back on their site. Meta being, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram. And he was, I don't know, 2-3 months ago, let back on Twitter. Phil, I don't think he's made a Twitter post yet. And I believe you've talked in the past about there being some issues between his Truth Social and what he can and can't post on the other networks. Is that true?
Yeah, so it is. So he's going to try and slip out of this and probably end up putting Devin Nunes out of a job while doing it. But, his contract with True Social, right, it gets really complicated, right? They set up True Social with this thing called a SPAC, and it's a type of like setting up a corporation. I'm not going to get into the weeds with it, but basically Trump then had to sign a contract as kind of like an employee or a person of his own social media platform. And because of that, he could not post anywhere else primarily before or even alternatively to True Social. So he's the word on the street is that they're currently in the works to figure out how this is going to go. But I don't think the Facebook thing does a whole lot for people other than let them know that Facebook is, basically a shill for whatever kind of profiteering they can do and probably not, worth much attention by most other people. Now, I get that. With that being said, you and I use it both personally and professionally. But at the end of the day, I mean, it just doesn't seem to do a whole lot. I mean, the times change so fast now that while Facebook was kind of the social media stronghold for a long time, they don't have that kind of reign over the marketplace.
There's so many options.
Yeah, there's so many other options. If anything, I would say Instagram, which is the same company, owns a slightly larger share of the share, portion of what's out there. But TikTok is huge now. There's there's so many different options, but people largely don't use this as much as they did when he was elected for his first term. So we'll see.
I kind of feel like Twitter was always his big one. I mean, that was the big thing. Donald Trump had a tweet out, this is obviously prior to him getting banned from Twitter and then reinstated. But, once upon a time during his time in the White House and even prior to that in his run up too, he was very big on using Twitter. Again, we haven't seen him use it yet. We'll see if and when he gets back on Facebook, et cetera, and how this all plays in with True Social. But so it's things to watch there. But speaking of Donald Trump, his vice president has been in the news quite a bit lately, Phil, with these classified documents. What do you think on that?
Yeah, so, after, we kind of sift through the Biden classified documents issue, then it comes out that Pence, in turn, also has classified documents that were found at his home. It's almost like all the cool kids are doing it, Cam. But shortly after we get that news about Pence, the National Records, NARA sends out basically a subpoena to all the other living presidents and vice presidents and entices them to go through their stuff just to make sure. But it appears, we kind of have mentioned this multiple times, that this may just be way more pervasive than most people know, right? That this is just way more common. And it also could have, I've heard several things, people talking about how how we generally are so safe and systematic about the way they handle classified documents that they vastly overclassify things. I even read something that was talking about how at one point, just because it was like a newspaper that was sitting on a desk near other documents in some capacity at the White House, and the actual newspaper got stamped classified because it was near, other documents. So it does seem like it's a little bit absurd, but nevertheless, Pence handled it correctly. He came out, he made a statement, and he is collaborating and working alongside federal agents to make sure that there's nothing improper happening.
Yeah, I mean, I thought Pence, like you said, handled it well. I mean, he's taking full responsibility. He said, and he said he wasn't aware that he had these documents, but that's not an excuse. It's my fault, at the end of the day. And so, I think that was a, pretty good look for Pence, at least how he handled it. Not necessarily that he had these documents, but here's something else too, kind of for our listeners to ponder for a minute. I mean, when you have someone like Mike Pence, right, the former vice president, he's getting ready to leave the White House, we're getting ready to leave Washington, D.C. and his vice president's residence, et cetera, or a former president or whatever. We have to realize these people are not backing up a U-Haul truck themselves and packing the truck. I mean, they have aides and they have staff who is handling all that for them. And so, in the case of Mike Pence, and you and I have kind of talked about this in private conversation, quite likely what it was Pence was going about his day-to-day stuff and seeing that his thing's getting packed out by staff. His staff is in a hurry and they're dumping, boxes into other boxes or whatever. And so classified material, not making an excuse, just saying that's probably how some of this ends there. And I believe Mike Pence when he says, I didn't know I had the stuff there. I mean, I think the same can be said for probably some of this other classified documents that are turning up. The question now is how we get a better handle on it. And so I don't know how much our listeners have seen, but the Senate Intel Committee, in specifically Senator Mark Warner of Virginia and Senator Marco Rubio, Florida, they're the co-chairs on this. They are pushing back saying we, as the Senate Intel Committee, wants to see these documents that have been found in, whether it was with Mike Pence, Joe Biden, or Donald Trump. We want to see it. And they're pointing out that we're not necessarily sitting here trying to blame them or figure out why or what, why these documents ended up in their homes or private boxes, whatever. They want to look at it from the security risk standpoint so they can look and see what kind of secrets or things may have been compromised, government secrets, I should say, may have been compromised here. So that's probably the greater thing going forward is how we can get a better handle on these classified documents, whether, as Phil, you mentioned, are we overclassifying? And then what, do we not have to classify as much? And ultimately, how do we handle it? And how do we keep this stuff from getting out in the future?
I don't know. What a mess. I'm sure there's going to be more, just based on the fact that we have 3 people already. Granted, one is a severely different case from the current president and the former vice president. But we will see. I'm sure this is definitely not the only case that this happens. Speaking of other criminal activities, though, last week we had 4 more Oath Keepers charged with seditious conspiracy. What do you know about this, Cam?
Yeah, you mentioned it. 3 members and 1 associate member, I guess. I don't know if he was not a full-fledged card-carrying member or what, but I just read an associate. You just said it, found guilty. This is in addition to some time back when the Oath Keepers founder, Stuart Rhodes, and then Kelly Meggs were found guilty of this seditious conspiracy also. In the case of these 4, they haven't set a sentencing date yet, but they are under house arrest to include no firearms. They're limited to their phone and internet usage. jury deliberation has begun. You know, I will say this for our listeners, to be clear, this seditious conspiracy is not something that we throw out every other day or see someone get charged with every other day. This is something that, rarely comes about. I think up until the January 6th, 2021 stuff, we hadn't seen anyone, I believe, charged with seditious conspiracy since like 1995. And then going back beyond that, it was a number of years or whatever. So this is not a charge thrown around a lot. However, based on everything that's coming out with these Oath Keepers, I wasn't shocked to see it. I guess the question is, going forward, how much time do they end up doing time being in jail?
Yeah, and again, keep in mind, whatever time that is for seditious conspiracy is going to be added on to other sentences, because that was not the only guilty charge that they received.
Yeah, they had a few.
The one thing that I'll say is kind of notable about this is it appears to be, and this isn't my original thoughts. I'm not going to claim this. I just heard this on some punditry, but this appears to be Justice Department kind of learning as they go. And so that first kind of trial, they were only able to get 2 of them. You mentioned Meggs and Rhodes on the seditious conspiracy trial. And this time it seemed like with less time, they were able to get all 4 of them done. And so I think this is, main justice kind of learning this process as they go and seeing what works with juries and what doesn't. And they're only going to get better at this as they move on, right? They have been crafting these cases. They've worked their way up. They've got a good level of experience now to see what's working. And so I have the feeling that the lightest sentences that we're going to get handed down to some of these, kind of top organizers in the various different groups, whether that be the Proud Boys, which their trial is going on right now, it's only going to get worse.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it seems as if, like you just said, they're learning as they go with this one. So I think definitely stuff to keep an eye on, as you mentioned, with the Proud Boys trial going on currently as well. So anything else on that one, Phil? Are you ready to move on to some House?
No, that's all I got. Let's move on to the U.S. Congress. So I think we've got House and Senate news, right?
Yeah, we do. So the one in the news here is that we're going to talk about is on Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota and the vote to remove her from the House Foreign Affairs Committee, or I should say the movement to do that. Now, in last week's episode, we kind of hashed out, you and I went back and forth on these committees and should they be on them, should they not? I don't want to just reopen that argument again, but what I will say, just again, to catch our listeners up on this, is House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has vowed to get Ilhan Omar removed from the House Foreign Affairs Committee, as I mentioned earlier. And so with all that being said, he's got this whole thing afoot of, well, let's bring this to a vote, et cetera, et cetera. It's looking like right now he may not have the votes to remove Congresswoman Omar. So again, let's keep in mind that there's a very slim majority for the Republicans in the House. And so he cannot afford to be losing members here. I mean, he needs basically all 222 of his Republicans to vote yes on this, and he can only afford to lose like 4 of them. So I don't know if you saw on this one, Phil, but he's had some that have spoken out and said, they're not going to do it. Namely, Victoria Spartz out of Indiana. She has said she is not interested in voting to remove Omar. She said she did not like it in 2020 or 2021 timeframe when some Republicans, Gosar, Marjorie Taylor Greene, et cetera, were removed. And so she does not want to keep playing these games. Nancy Mace, a Republican congresswoman out of South Carolina, has said something similar. Mace being a fairly moderate Republican. The one that surprised me, though, and I think is kind of catching a lot of political pundits by surprise, is Ken Buck of Colorado. And he has come out and said he is not interested in voting to remove Congresswoman Omar. And for our listeners, Ken Buck he's a Freedom Caucus, very conservative, I would say far-right Republican. And so I think that one has got people by surprise. But what Buck is saying is kind of similar to Victoria Spartz. He's like, look, I am not interested in playing games and going back and forth on pulling people off committees. And he'd just rather not do this and go there. And so I think that one has taken some people, probably Speaker McCarthy, even by surprise. One other thing, though, I'll throw in here, Phil. He's got another chip in here, if you will, or chip down. That's Congressman Greg Steube out of Florida, who just a couple of weeks ago had that home accident where he fell off 25 feet or off a 25-foot high ladder. This guy's out on medical leave. Well, he can't vote by proxy because that was taken out recently. That was one of the things McCarthy had was now you have to vote in person. And so he already is down Steube. Possibly these other three Republicans are saying they're not going to vote that way. He's got some other moderates. I think Brian Fitzpatrick hasn't said how he's going to vote. Fitzpatrick, a Republican out of Pennsylvania. There's a couple other moderates that they're not sure on. I know I heard an interview the other day on Morning Joe with Fitzpatrick, and he's like, I just don't, I want there to be one fair standard. So, Phil, with all that being said, does Kevin McCarthy even bring this to a vote, or is he just going to let this one die and leave her on the Foreign Affairs Committee?
I don't know what Kevin McCarthy's going to do. I don't think anybody knows what Kevin McCarthy's going to do. I mean, he seems to take a stand one day and then go back on it the next. At the end of the day, I don't think any of it holds too much weight. She stays on or she comes off. It's not going to ultimately make that big of a difference other than, yes, this kind of behavior is going to continue for probably reasons that don't matter all that much. Good for him, I guess. If he doesn't get the votes, like that would almost be poetic. But with that being said, he's got a lot of other battles going on right now. I mean, we're still in the midst of this debt ceiling standoff. We don't know what's going to happen there, but McCarthy apparently is going to Washington D.C. on Wednesday, so we'll see if that sways anything. But yeah, Kevin McCarthy is the least predictable person. Just because he takes a stand and then that seems to wash away with hours or days or weeks or whatever it takes.
Yeah, you mentioned McCarthy going to D.C. Specifically in Washington, D.C., he will be going to the White House to sit down with President Biden.
Yes, sorry. Of course he's in D.C. He's going to the White House is what I meant.
Yeah, that's supposed to happen midweek. We'll see on that. I have a feeling our next episode or two will definitely be talking some debt ceiling stuff. But yeah, certainly some news there. But also for our listeners, I think keep an eye on this whole Ilhan Omar thing, because again, if McCarthy's got pushback in his own, on his own side of the aisle, that will be something to watch. And like I said, I think the fact that Ken Buck, who's definitely in that Freedom Caucus, et cetera, I think the fact that he stood up and said, no, I'm not going to do it. I think it's catching people by surprise. So we'll continue to watch this. We'll see if Speaker McCarthy even brings this to a vote, or if enough Republicans say they're not in, that he just decides to not bring it up for a vote. One more thing I will say, though, they're not 100% sure that all Democrats will necessarily vote to keep her on that committee, although likely they will. But there is some discussion that there may be some of the moderate Democrats, specifically some of the Jewish Democrats, that may not want to see her on there based on some past comments, whatever. Bottom line, listeners, keep watching that, and we'll see how that goes. And if we have other big news there, you and I will certainly chat about it in the future. I want to shift to the Senate real quick. Some Senate news, I should say. We got Adam Schiff has announced he is going to get in the California race out there for Dianne Feinstein's seat in 2024. Phil, what do you know about that?
Well, so I know that he announced he was, and now he will be the second official candidate in the running. Technically the third, because the incumbent has not announced that she won't be running again. So we shall see. Obviously he is a very different type of Democrat than Katie Porter. But you know what? On this one, I don't necessarily see it as a great decision. I can understand him wanting to be in the Senate. I can understand the fact that optics are not all that great with him not being on any House committees right now. However, it should be noted that Adam Schiff wins pretty overwhelmingly in a district, outside of Los Angeles. And while Katie Porter also is in a district outside of Los Angeles, she's in a, Republican heavy, Trump voting, district in Orange County, winning as a progressive Democrat. And there's something to be said that she, Adam Schiff has won his elections pretty easily, for the most part, while Katie Porter is grinding him out there and then winning in a Republican heavy district. So, that's kind of my thoughts on it. I'd wish there wasn't, that much high-profile competition for this one particular seat, but that's the world we live in.
Yeah, and I'll say this. I mean, whoever wins that Democratic primary will likely go on to win the seat because, again, California, fairly blue state, and it certainly has been that way with their senators. I think it's an interesting dynamic. I will say this. We don't know who else may get in. I keep hearing rumors of Barbara Lee getting in that race, et cetera. So likely there's going to be a stiff, very competitive race out there, at least in the Democratic primary. So we'll see going forward with that. But anything else for Senate news, Phil, before we wrap this up?
That's all I got for today. So I think it was most of the week was taken over by violence in the country, unfortunately, and hopefully we can kind of buck that trend moving forward and just get back to regular politics because it's frankly more fun and less kind of gloomy to talk about. But I will say, if you've already listened to this episode and you're midweek and you're looking for some stuff in the news and want to hear a take on it, feel free to go to our Instagram, our Facebook page, all of which you can link to from pocketpolitics.co, and you can check us out. We are posting content all the time on our different social medias. And then also remember, if maybe listening isn't always that convenient, you can always pull us up on YouTube. We're working on kind of expanding that coverage as well. But again, you can link to that from our website, pocketpolitics.co. Cam?
Yeah, and definitely tell your friends all about it as well. We certainly appreciate the listenership. Reach out to us if there's stuff you want us to talk about. We're happy to take your feedback. So, all right, as you mentioned, Phil, another great week. I certainly had fun with this. It's time to wrap this thing up with our parting shots, and I'll take the first parting shot this week. For this one, I want to go to the great state of Texas and San Antonio specifically. So the San Antonio Zoo is offering a Valentine's special day greeting for exes out there who just want to, send a message, I guess. So you can pay a fee starting for as little as $10 to the San Antonio Zoo, and they will name a cockroach after your ex. And then in turn, they will take said cockroach and feed it to an animal. So, and there are various upgrades you can do. I guess you can spend as much as $150 on this thing. And if you do the $150 upgrade, they'll send like an actual personalized video message, I guess, to your ex showing them the cockroach that they were named after. And then they will actually then show that very cockroach being devoured by an animal. There are also other things. I guess you can name a rodent after your ex, or a vegetable, I guess, if you're not into seeing, cockroaches being demolished by animals, whatever. But at the end of the day, Valentine's Day is coming up. So, hey, if you've got that special ex out there, you might just want to reach out to the San Antonio Zoo and get a cockroach named after them that can in turn be fed to a ravenous animal at the zoo. So, yeah, something to look forward to as we near Valentine's Day here in February, Phil. That's all I've got on my parting shot. What do you got this week?
Well, for all those people who say civility is lost, buy your ex a cockroach, right?
Yeah.
This week I don't have much. The biggest thing is the Kansas City Chiefs are in fact going to the Super Bowl. So it was a pretty entertaining game last night. I don't think either team between us or the Bengals played as well as they could have. But nevertheless, it was a good game. And hopefully Patrick Mahomes has some time to kind of recover and shake off some of his injury woes before the big game. But we will see February 12th, the Philadelphia Eagles against the Kansas City Chiefs.
All right.
And I think that's all I got.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to that Super Bowl coming up. So, all right, it's been fun, Phil. It's time to sign off here. So, again, thanks everyone for listening, and until next time.
All right, bye.